Hey class, welcome to class number 4. Today's class topic is bed preparation. So we'll be talking about all things bed prep. How to get those beds ready, whether you're starting from scratch or you're just doing the seasonal maintenance required for bed preparation. How to get those beds ready for planting. So we'll go ahead and get started. So bed preparation includes numerous things. Today we're going to cover site selection. So if you're starting with a new site, we want to look at some criteria around that. We're going to look at the actual bed shaping, right? So constructing beds. We're going to talk a little bit about weed pressure. That's very important with bed preparation. Much of what we do in bed preparation revolves around addressing weed pressure. And we're going to look at soil improvement as well. So jumping into site selection. So let's say you are looking for a new spot to start a garden. Or start a small market farm. You're going to start by looking at a few important criteria. You want to make sure the site has enough sunlight. You want to make sure you dial the slope according to your soil type. You want to make sure you have a good existing soil type. And you also want to factor in a few other outside forces that could be acting on the site, like wind, weed seed, contaminants, etc. We call those sectors. So let's look at sunlight. So for most crops, what we call full sun crops, you're going to be looking for at least 6 to 8 hours. Ideally, you want to have some more sunlight than that, but this is kind of the minimum threshold for most crops. You don't want too much sunlight. At our latitude and with the continental climate that we have, our summer days can be really long and they can be really hot. So having excessive sunlight during the peak heat of summer can really cause stress in your crops, and it can also result in higher evapotranspiration rates, which basically means you're going to have to water more. So it can be beneficial if you have some sort of shade element, like a shade tree, to the west of your site, so that you can block out a few of those afternoon sun hours, which can be the most intense. So you also want to think about how the sun angles change from solstice to solstice. So from the shortest day of the year to the longest day of the year, if you live on the equator, it's pretty much constant year round, the solar angles, but up in the higher latitudes, you do have quite a bit of seasonal variation. So you want to be able to see how is that sun going to track in the winter, when maybe I'm growing things under cold frames, in the spring, and then of course in the summer. A really reliable way to track solar paths is to use some of these sun surveyor apps. So there's actually an app called Sun Surveyor, and you put in your location and you put in the date of when you're wanting to know what the solar angles will be, and you can basically it calibrates itself and can give you an idea of how the sun will track throughout the day on that specific day of the year. So like, for example, in this screenshot here, we have the date set to today, April 20th, and you can see the actual sun in the picture, and then you can see like the representational sun there on the screenshot. So they're pretty close. That could probably be calibrated a little bit more, but you can see how the sun tracks from 12 p.m. on the left to 1 p.m. And then once you get closer to 2 p.m. on this day of the year, you start to go behind, the sun is going to be shaded by that tree in the shot. So this can give you an idea of just how many hours you're working with on a particular site. Very important. So that's sunlight. The next thing you might want to look at is slope. So you want to think about drainage, especially if you have heavier soils. So if you have clayey soils that don't drain very well, you want to make sure that you're not going to create beds that in effect cause drainage issues, hold lots of water back, especially on heavy soils, right? Because you're going to have waterlogging. It's going to be harder to get in with equipment during the wet months. So you want to design your beds to drain water. Now, you don't want them to drain too much water, right? We don't want to, if you wanted to promote your beds to drain water, you could put them in line with the slope, right? So you could run them uphill to downhill. But that's not really what you want, depending on how significant your slope is. Because when you slope the beds too much, you could be looking at an erosive situation where you have a lot of erosion happening because of the high slopes, right? Because when you're doing annual agriculture, there's some degree of disturbance involved, right? The soil can be bare for certain windows in time while crops are filling in, etc. So you don't want to create a scenario where you're vulnerable to lots of erosion, especially with sandy soils. So it's kind of finding that balance between sloped enough to drain excess water, but not sloped so much to where you're going to be experiencing erosion. So typically you want to shoot for beds that are about 2 to 3% in slope off of contour. Contour would be dead level, right? 2 to 3% off of that. That's the rate at which water will just begin to move slowly. So it's going to shed, but it's not going to be erosive. And then, of course, yes, raising beds helps buffer problems associated with slope. So if you have a really flat area and it just is poorly drained and that's really the only site available to you, raising those beds is going to uplift the grow zone, right? The rhizosphere, the root zone for the plants. It's going to uplift that and allow excess water to drain down into the walking paths. And alternatively, if you have really sandy soils and it's really sloped, you're going to be vulnerable to erosion. So raising those beds can protect your soil inputs. So if you put fertilizer down, if you put compost down, if you just direct seeded those beds, having them raised is going to give the water somewhere to go. It's going to go into the footpaths, right? And that's where it's going to flow. You don't necessarily want it flowing over your beds and carrying away, precious material like fertilizer, compost, and seed. Just looking at this picture real quick, these are the beds at John 3:16. You can see, I don't know if you can really see this in the photo, but the beds are somewhat diagonally juxtaposed against each other. And that's because this is on a ridge and we oriented them this way to achieve that 2 to 3% slope. So you typically are putting in beds. It might seem arbitrary, like which way do I orient the beds? East, west, north, south. You want to look at your existing slope and kind of base it off of that. Soil type is another pretty important criteria for site selection. You want to start with the best soil you can. So I have multiple spots on my property that would be appropriate for farming in the context of like they have enough sun, the slope is fine, but there really is a huge difference between the east side of my property and the west side of my property in soil quality. So, I started focusing, my agricultural projects on the east side of my property where the soil is just much deeper and much richer, as opposed to the west part of the property where it's really low in organic matter and just really poor soil. So just kind of a review on like what are some of the criteria for determining whether a soil is good. The video we watched gives you a lot of insights. That was class number 2, soil. But if we remember, infiltration is very important. So we want to make sure that we have good infiltration. Too heavy of a soil can cause problems, right, for us with infiltration. And too sandy of a soil, too good of infiltration can also cause problems, right? We're going to have to water more. So finding that balance with infiltration is key. Organic matter, obviously we're going to prefer to start with soils that are higher in organic matter so that we can get all of those, all of that soil functionality, right? That comes along with having high organic matter in the soil. And right, the quick and easy way to determine organic matter content visually is just the color, right? We want darker soil versus lighter soil. And then, the soil food web. So the soil food web is the biological component of the soil. We can tell that there's good soil biology if we see a lot of earthworms, because earthworms are at the top of the soil food chain and the soil food web, right? They're like apex predators in the soil. So if you see things like earthworms and even things like garter snakes and large arthropods like spiders, those are all indicative that there's a larger, rich microbiome in the soil, right? Because that's the basis, that's the first trophic order of the soil food web. You got to have all the bacteria and fungi to feed the next trophic order and to feed the next trophic order in the soil food web. So yeah, if you see a lot of earthworms, if you can uncover your soil and maybe dig in and you find 2, 3, maybe even 5 earthworms in a square foot, you're in good shape. So just a few other considerations for site selection. Being exposed to high winds is not necessarily a plus. High winds are going to stress plants out. They can be sometimes good in an orchard context for ventilation, right? So you don't have as much fungal issues associated with stagnant air. But in general, for vegetables, high winds are going to cause a certain degree of stress in your crops. And just like excessive sunlight, it's going to increase evapotranspiration, which means more water being pulled out of the soil by the plants, and ultimately more inputs of irrigation. Also, high winds are really not fun when you're dealing with row cover. So when you have like remake cover cloth over your beds, maybe for shade, maybe for temperature moderation, those cloths will blow everywhere if your site's vulnerable to high winds. So something to think about. The less existing weed pressure, the better. Absolutely. So when you're picking a site, if you have lots of options, assessing the weed pressure, what kind of weeds are currently on site A versus site B, and how established is that community of weeds, right? We want to make our jobs as easy as possible with our approaches to weed management. So picking a site that has relatively lower weed pressure is definitely a plus. Environmental history. So this is getting at what was the site used for historically, in anthropogenic terms, like how did humans interact with this site over time? Was it grazed by cattle? If so, did they use broadleaf herbicides like Grazon on the field, which can be very detrimental to most of the vegetable crops that we grow, broadleaf crops? Is there oil and gas infrastructure on the site? Was that managed well and was that contained well? Was there an old house on the site? A lot of older houses used um, certain chemicals. I think one is chlordane in the foundations before there was a lot of environmental regulation. There might have been asbestos used in older homes too. If that house was demoed, you know, what was left behind. So we want to think about an environmental history. It could even be an urban lot that has been sprayed with herbicides and synthetic fertilizers for years. So we just want to think about how was the landscape used. Was there anything? Was there any activity that would discourage us from wanting to grow crops in that space, especially crops that have direct contact with the soil, like root crops like radishes, beets, potatoes, carrots, etc. And then you want to make sure your site has a good water source, and that water source is close and convenient. And you want that site to have good proximity to not only water, but also you. You don't want that site to be way off in the back 40. You don't want that site to be somewhere where you can't access it easily. The more interaction and the more eyes you have on that site, the better your management practices will be. You'll see when something needs to be done, and you'll be able to more easily do that task versus having a site that's kind of out of sight, out of mind. So all of these considerations, sunlight, slope, soil, and then some of the random considerations we mentioned here, I might have even missed a few, but these are some really good starting points. So if you create like a checklist or a grid, you can see, how you meet these criteria. And if you are lucky enough to have multiple sites to choose from, within your property, potential sites, you can kind of weigh them on these criteria and see what makes the most sense. We've covered site selection. Let's say we've picked a site and it meets most or all of our criteria. The next thing we want to talk about is the actual construction of raised beds. So let's talk about why we want to do raised beds. One thing that happens when we raise a bed is we double the topsoil. So we're taking the soil out of what will be the pathway, right? The pathway for foot traffic and also for equipment traffic, and we're putting that soil on top of the adjacent bed, and by doing that we're basically doubling the topsoil. This is really helpful if you have a thin topsoil layer. So if you don't have a lot of topsoil to work with, doing a raised bed is gonna double that number, which can be huge. When you create raised beds, you're promoting drainage. So this is especially true if you have poor drainage, poor infiltration, because your soils are heavy. Building that bed up is going to keep those plants' roots out of wet anaerobic soil conditions. So it gives them a little bit of elevation so that they're not drowning. It defines the path space, so it gives you, a framework of where to walk and where not to walk. That's helpful. It's going to reduce runoff of soil inputs. So inputs like compost, fertilizer, even seeds. If you're broadcast seeding, you don't want that stuff washing away. So when you raise your beds like this, what it does is it creates these drainage paths in the furrows, the pathways, for water to move and go, and it reduces the amount of runoff on your beds, because what's key here is you're not going to have water running up and over your beds. It's going to drain off the beds like water does off of a ridge. So it can greatly reduce soil erosion and the runoff of soil inputs on your beds. I guess it goes with saying that you may not need to do bed shaping. You get all these benefits in most cases above, but if you have really high infiltration rates, like your soil is very, very sandy, and you're on a very gentle slope, There may be situations where you don't need to raise your beds, but if you have heavy soils at all, raising your beds is definitely an investment you're going to want to make. It's also important to mention that weed pressure is going to be the highest the first season after beds are shaped, because what you're doing is you're taking all this soil and you're stirring it up, right? You're taking weed seeds that are in the weed seed bank, weed seeds that are in the soil, and you're moving those to the surface. So in your pathways where those weed seeds were buried and most likely not viable, you've moved those weed seeds up to the surface where they're going to germinate. So it is important to note that your weed pressure is most likely going to be the highest your first season, which, given what we talked about in plant starting class, we talked about how that first year when weed pressure is really high, it's probably best to focus mostly on transplanted crops versus direct seeding crops. So there's a few tools at our disposal for bed shaping. This is a great one. This is the BCS walk behind tractor. This tractor is available to all students in the market farming course. It's a walk behind tractor. It's pretty easy to operate. And what it does is it has a rotary plow attachment that kicks the soil, stirs it up from its anything in its path, and it kicks it out to the side. It deposits it on the adjacent bed. So right now, Colby's walking down what will become the footpath, the dead space, and that soil is being taken from what will be the footpath, and it's being deposited on the bed next to it. So it's building up that bed, and it's creating that furrow for the pathway. So on a larger scale, if you're going to be using a riding tractor, this is the steps for bed construction that we'd advise. So if you're starting from sod, going through with a plow is going to break that sod and turn it over. But in plowing, you are going to leave behind pretty chunky material, as you can see there. That won't be easy to bed shape. So the next step after plowing is to come through with a disker. And a disker is going to chop up that material to where it's manageable for the bed shaper. These actions of plowing and disking are similar in their effect on the soil as tillage would be. But remember, this is just an initial action. Once these beds are shaped, we won't be tilling them anymore. So it's just a one-time event to get the sod broken up and to get the bed shaped. Once you're done disking, you're ready for the bed shaper. Here's a little slow-mo video. So this is the bed shaper implement we have at John 3:16. You'll notice that the tires are riding in the furrows. They're riding in the footpath. So that's where the compaction will be. But that's okay because we're not compacting our beds. The beds are going to be nice, light, and fluffy. We're targeting that compaction on what will become the footpaths and the paths for the tractor tires. And that bed shaper there, it's adjustable as far as width. It has a little bit of flexibility there, but it makes, I think, between a 30 and 40 inch bed. And yeah, it usually does the job with just one pass. And the beds are shaped. So now we want to look at the calendar of events. When are we going to do what? What are we going to do in the fall? What should we be doing in the spring? What should we be doing in the summer? There's variations to this, but I want to kind of walk you through an ideal calendar of events, and then we can talk about how you would make adjustments if you're trying to get started earlier or you're getting started later on your bed construction. So I think it's the best to start in the fall. I think that would be a great time to construct beds. Now, that might not be ideal if you're sitting here and it's spring or if it's summer. Maybe it's even winter, and you're wanting to get started so that so that you can get started as soon as possible. That's fine, and we'll talk about the variations on the calendar. But ideally, we'd be getting started in fall with bed construction. So we looked at how you construct the beds, right, with the BCS or the riding tractor. You could even do it by hand on a small scale by hand digging out the footpaths. But whichever way you're doing it, after the beds are constructed, we want to talk about a few things you'll want to do next in the fall. We're going to talk about tarping. We're going to talk about mulching. We're going to talk about cover cropping and planting fall crops. So let's go ahead and look at those. Okay, so it's fall. You just constructed your beds. One thing you can do next is you can lay opaque tarp over your beds. This is available on farmersfriend.com. I think that's where we got it. And you can lay the tarp down and you can weigh it down with either straw bales. We also are using sandbags here. That's going to help keep it from tearing. You don't want to have any sharp edges on the tarp, and you want to make sure it's weighted down. So if it's windy, it's going to be down for a few months. So if it's windy, it's not going to blow away. But what this is going to do is it's going to halt any cool season weed pressure over the fall, winter, and spring. So when you peel that tarp back in the spring, it's going to be good to go for direct seeding. So we would lay this tarp down over beds that we intend to direct seed in the spring. I don't have a great picture of this, but another alternative to using black tarp over the fall, winter, and spring is you can take advantage of fall leaves in the fall, and you can deep mulch your bed. So imagine that the tarp's not here, and instead we just put kind of like a copious amount of leaf litter on top of the beds. That is another viable alternative. Leaves can be very abundant in the fall. There are some disadvantages to using leaves. If you are going to direct seed that area in the spring, having leaves on the beds is going to create a situation where you have to rake all the leaves off to get to the soil surface. The tarp is going to be much easier to pull off. So I would only use deep mulches over the fall and winter if you plan on transplanting crops the following spring into that soil. Because when you transplant crops, all you have to do is just dig out a hole for the crop to be transplanted in. You don't have to rake all the material off the bed. So in addition to tarping or deep mulching, another path we can take in the fall after our beds are constructed is sowing a cool season cover crop. So here at John 3:16, we are sowing winter rye, winter peas, and crimson clover, all annual cool season cover crops. We sow them in a cocktail mix. Once they've been sowed at the right density and they're just being broadcasted, we'll go through with like a leaf rake that has straightened tines at the end and just lightly work that seed in, and then we'll cover it with a light straw dressing and wait for some precipitation, and before you know it, that seed will germinate. So one last path we can take in the fall once we have newly constructed beds is to plant actual crops, economic crops, not cover crops. That's fine. I would suggest doing transplanted crops, so like a deep mulch system. Remember, leaves are very abundant in the fall, so you could mulch beds with leaves so that you're addressing that weed pressure. Because remember, it's the worst on newly constructed beds the first calendar year after you've built the beds. But you could deep mulch and do cool season transplanting crops under row cover. So I'm going to kind of breeze over winter. Winter is a time of little activity. Unless you're growing crops throughout the winter, like under low tunnels or in a hoop house, and we're really just not going to cover that in this class. So what's really going on over the winter is if you laid tarps down in the fall, those tarps are just sitting there. If you laid deep mulches down in the fall with like leaves or straw, those mulches are sitting there. If you sowed cover crops, those cover crops, they're going to be growing, albeit quite slowly over the winter. They'll stay pretty short over the winter. They don't really shoot up until the spring, but they will be there growing. If you have winter crops growing, those will be growing too, but those would probably be under low tunnels or high tunnels. Garlic is planted, one of the crops that's planted pretty early. Folks will plant that here in like December, maybe sometimes even earlier, and that's a very cold hardy crop, and it does not have to be covered. So that will be sitting there over the winter if you planted garlic. Other than that, you're going to be, on the indoor side, you're going to be looking at getting your spring starts going. Spring starts that you're going to transplant in the early spring, like brassicas, for example. Okay, so once we get to spring on the calendar, we'll go through and look at some videos of examples of each of these, but here's some of the main things we're doing. If we laid those tarps in the fall, we're going to be pulling those tarps in the spring. If we laid mulch down in the fall and we are on a smaller scale, we're going to be perhaps raking back that mulch because maybe we didn't have tarps available to us and we decided to use something biological like mulch. So we might be raking that mulch back in order to plant. We may be not raking that mulch back if we deep mulched, and we might be transplanting those cool season crops that we started indoors in the winter. It's time to transplant those into the deep mulch. And another thing we might be doing is if we sowed cool season cover crops in the fall, those will be nice and established by spring, and it'll be time to mow, kill, and solarize those cover crops. So let's take a look at those events. So this isn't the best video of actually removing the whole tarp, but I did just peel this tarp back just to show you what you get underneath the tarp when it's been sitting there all fall, all winter, and all spring. So as you peel this tarp back, look at the soil. There's a little bit of residual straw that was there, but that wouldn't necessarily be there. But you can just look. It's like a blank slate. There's a worm right there. It doesn't have any of the cool season weed pressure that would have otherwise been there if we had just left the soil bare and uncovered, right? So it totally stunted and retarded that cool season weed pressure, and it's just a blank slate. Any weeds that were there just got turned into worm castings, and that is ready to direct seed. So let's look at a deep mulch scenario. So here's a bed that was deep mulched with leaves in the fall. It's the same effect that you get with a tarp, right? When you peel that back, it's a blank slate. There might be a few perennial weeds, but the annual weed pressure was totally stunted. Like I mentioned before, we don't really want to direct seed a bed like this unless it's on a very small scale, because it is quite a bit of work to rake all of those leaves off the bed. If we deep mulched a bed in the fall, it's because we plan on transplanting crops into it in the spring. By choosing to transplant into a deep mulch system, what we're doing is that mulch is still mitigating all that weed pressure, but our transplants have that head start. And all we have to do is scoot a little mulch aside, plant our transplant, and then mulch right back up against our plants. And our plants have a great advantage, and we're still doing a good job to deter annual weed pressure and also weaken perennial weed pressure. Okay, so let's say you cover crop in the fall. What do we do with that cover crop in the no-till system? We're not going to fill it in. What we're going to do is we're going to mow it. It's going to chop it into fine pieces, and it's going to, for the
most part kill the cover crop. Most of the cover crops are killed in these cool season. Now, it's not going to necessarily kill everything. There might be some latent cool season weeds, and some of the cover crops might still have some life in them after the mowing pass. So what we can use is a UVI treated clear plastic. This is the same plastic that's used on hoop houses. It has a UV inhibitor in it that keeps it from degrading in the sunlight. This plastic will last you a really long time. It's a little bit of an investment, but it's not going to break down on you like the non-treated plastics will, like a painter's tarp at a hardware store would. Definitely don't use that. If that breaks down on you, you'll have microplastics all over your garden. Not good. So with this tarp, it's really easy to roll out. You're gonna take it out, and you want it to cover the beds. So make sure to measure your beds before you buy the tarp. Make sure you get the right size, and you're gonna want to weigh it down just like the opaque tarp. You can use straw bales, you can use sandbags. Just avoid things that have sharp edges. Like you wouldn't want to use a T-post or a rock or firewood or something like that, because this tarp is expensive and you don't want to cut it. Make sure there's no irrigation lines underneath the tarp, because it can get very hot underneath this tarp and that could melt your irrigation lines. You don't want that. But after about 2 to 3 days, depending on how warm and sunny it is outside, everything under this tarp is going to be dead. So if there was any annual weed seeds that sprouted, those will be killed. If there's any cover crop that's still alive, it will be also terminated. And it only takes a few days. So that being said, make sure that it is, warm. Like ideally it's at least 75 degrees if you're trying to terminate a cool season cover crop. That'll make it like 95 to 100 underneath the plastic, and that should be enough to terminate any cool season plant. Since it only takes 2 to 3 days, you don't have to have a piece of plastic that's big enough to cover the entire area you cover cropped. You can get on a succession. So like in my case, that plastic covers 4 of my beds. I could mow kill and then solarize, 4 beds at a time, and then just move the plastic down the line. And if I had, say, like 16 beds I needed to do this with, at 2 to 3 days per succession, I could do that in 4 events, and it might take like a little over a week, and then it would all be done. So I don't need to buy a huge piece of plastic that's harder to manage and more expensive. I can use the same piece just by moving it down in succession. After the tarps are moved, after a few days, these beds are good to go for transplanting. You can transplant warm season crops into them, cool season crops. These will not be ideal for direct seeding. These will be ideal for transplanting. So you're only cover cropping areas in the fall that you plan to transplant in the spring, not direct seed.
That's a wrap.
Okay, so you've either pulled your tarp back, you've raked your leaves back, or you've pulled the solar sheeting back. It's time to add some soil inputs. So one input that you should add, hopefully on a yearly basis, is compost. So this is some full sun compost. You can use 3-gallon buckets, 5-gallon buckets, and you just want to roughly spread that compost on the bed. You're going to be able to go back through the bed with either a hand rake or a rotary plow. I'm sorry, not a rotary plow, a power harrow, and integrate that compost better into the beds. But adding compost on a yearly basis is great. Compost isn't the only thing you're going to want to add. If you did your soil test and you realized you're deficient in minerals, you're going to want to add those at this time. So my minerals are pretty balanced in my bed. The only thing I'm coming up deficient on the past few years is phosphorus. So I'm just going to add some rock phosphorus to these beds. I kind of have an idea of how much to add in my application, but in your application, you want to base it off your soil test results and add the amount of pounds per square feet that you need. Here's another example at John 3:16. We're adding the needed minerals to our beds. We had just pulled our tarp back. You can see it, what a blank slate those beds are. Those are just beautiful. And the farm hands, the men in recovery, are adding the minerals to the beds at this point. After we've added our soil minerals, the next thing we can do is either broad fork or deep mulch. Typically it'd be better to broad fork before you mulch, because before you mulch you're typically going to lay down irrigation. For this demonstration, I didn't lay irrigation down. I didn't have time. I'll have to go back and retroactively do that, but right now I went ahead and started with mulching. So I'm taking straw mulch. That bed's been solarized. We've added compost, we've added amendments, and I am going to deep mulch that bed. I break up the mulch to get to make it more volume, right? So if you just lay flakes down, those are going to be nice thick flakes, but you're not going to get as much coverage on your bed. So you just kind of develop a technique for breaking it up and ripping it apart. There are tractor implements that shred mulch, where you can like load a bale into it and it shreds and dispenses it. That would of course probably be a worthwhile investment on a large scale if you're using a lot of deep mulch in your system. But on my scale, I just spread it by hand. If you can do something by hand and you have the time to, that's obviously better for me than buying a expensive piece of equipment. So there's that bed all mulched up. Make sure to pick up the bale twine. That's not something you want getting caught in your tractor. So it's reusable stuff. You can reuse it. You'll actually see how we reuse it here in just a second. But that bed's all mulched up and ready to go. The next step I'll show you is broad forking. So broad forking is really helpful in a no-till system. What it does is it's like a chiropractic readjustment for the soil. You get those tines down in there and you're just kind of uplifting the soil. You're decompacting it and you're opening up, airspace down in there. You're opening up, space for water to infiltrate. And it's a little bit of a workout, but it's not too bad. And this is a way to get water to better infiltrate and get more airspace down in the soil, reduce compaction without tilling. And typically you wouldn't broad fork once the mulch is already down, because ideally we would have laid irrigation before we laid the mulch down. If I had irrigation underneath that mulch right now, I wouldn't be broad forking, because the broad fork tines could puncture the irrigation. So we probably should have, in this case, broad forked before we laid down irrigation and then mulched. But in this case, it's okay. You can retroactively lay irrigation. It's a little bit of a pain, but that's doable. So just for example's sake, here's what broad forking looks like. Just a quick look. Oh, I'm playing with a little snake there, but just a quick look. Deep mulch system, after you've done all the bed prep in the spring, laying that deep mulch down, it's the same idea as deep mulch in the fall. I'm probably using straw in the spring because leaves are less available unless I stockpiled them. But you're just creating an environment that's not conducive to annual weeds, for sure, and way less conducive to perennial weeds, so you can transplant right into that. Another step I want to mention is laying trellis. So if that might be a part of your bed prep, if you're growing a crop that's going to be trellis, like say cucumbers or tomatoes, something like that, maybe beans, pole beans. So for trellising, pretty simple method that I use. You go ahead and lay T-posts down the center line. I couldn't find my T-post pounder, but luckily I don't really need it because my soil's really good. But if you have tougher soil, having a T-post pounder is better than a sledge. And then I just use hog paneling. So you can use cow panel, hog panel. I got a bunch for free, so that's just what I'm using. And you put your T-post in, lay your hog panel there, kind of rest it up against the side of the T-post, and that kind of lets you know where your next T-post needs to go. Nice to have not too wide of a bed, so you can straddle it like that to line your T-post up. You know, Curtis Stone says 30-inch beds are, you know, good ergonomically, you know, so you can cross over the beds and you can straddle them like that. Mine are a lot wider than 30 inches, but that's kind of the idea behind having a less wide bed width. So yeah, put the T-post in, put the panels there. Those two adjacent panels are going to overlap on the same T-post. And then essentially what I use to fasten the panels to the T-post is I use that baling twine, you know. It's like I have a bunch of it. It's free, it's cheap, it's there. So I just do a double overhand and tie the panels to the T-post, and that works for me. And there's trellising. Okay, so summertime, it's pretty much the exact same as spring. You have crops that are growing in the spring. You have the cover crops, right? You have to terminate those crops to get the next crop in, and the way you do that is you mow kill and then you solarize. So it's the same thing in the summer. So spring crops like lettuce that have been growing throughout the spring, when you're done harvesting those, you're no longer wanting to harvest from that crop. You're ready to move on to the next crop. You're gonna mow kill the lettuce, you're gonna solarize it, and then you're gonna be ready for the next crop, just like before. Let's say it's a tomato crop that you planted early in the spring, and now you're midway through the summer and you wanna plant a succession of some other transplanted crop, maybe like cucumbers. All you're gonna do is you're gonna go through with your mower, you're gonna mow kill you're going to pull up your irrigation first. You don't ever want to mow kill when you have irrigation down. You'll pull out the irrigation, you'll mow kill the tomatoes. It's okay if there's straw and deep mulch in the system. The mower will go over that just fine. You're going to mow kill those tomatoes, and then it's going to be a blank slate. Maybe you solarize, you might not even have to. And then it's a blank slate to transplant a new crop like cucumbers. So you're just terminating one crop and going to the next. One more thing that you might want to plant in the summer besides economic crops are warm season cover crops. So warm season cover crops are the same as cool season cover crops in that they are going to build soil health, they're going to sequester carbon, they're going to increase soil function. But in the summer, there's a lot more solar energy available, so warm season cover crops can get a lot bigger and equal a lot more carbon ultimately in the soil. If you are going to warm season cover crop an area, you want to make sure that you've prepped it for direct seeding. So in the springtime, instead of deep mulching a bed, right? Remember, it's harder to rake that mulch off, especially at a larger scale if you're going to direct seed something after. Maybe you used a tarp in the spring, like an opaque tarp, and you laid it over a few beds that you anticipate warm season cover cropping, right? So here in these pictures, what we have is hairy indigo and teff grass. These are great warm season cover crops for annual beds. There's a lot of great warm season cover crops, but many of them get really tall and really big, and they get really fibrous stalks, and it'll make it harder to reincorporate those back into the garden. It'll make it harder to mow kill them. Those stalks can be really thick. Teff grass and hairy indigo, they don't get fibrous like that. They're very easy to mow kill. And then hairy indigo also, in addition to being a biomass crop like teff grass, it also is a nitrogen fixer. So it also fixes nitrogen into the soil. And then we're back to fall. Summer's over, we've grown a lot of crops. Now it's time to do, figure out what our crop plan is for next year, and we're gonna figure out which areas we're gonna tarp, which areas we're gonna deep mulch, which areas we're gonna cover crop, and also which areas we're gonna plant with economic crops. So that's the cycle.
Next, I want to talk about some alternative cycles, right? So let's get into that. Okay, so let's say you missed your window to get your beds constructed in the fall, and you're feeling like you're a little bit behind, and it's springtime. That's okay. We've been putting in some beds this spring for class, and maybe you put in your beds in the fall, but you just want to expand more in the spring. So it's no problem. You can do your bed shaping just like you would have done in the fall. You can do that in the spring, and then from there, what you can do is you can go to a deep mulch system. So those beds can get constructed, and then you can just put a lot of mulch on those beds in preparation for transplanting, just like you would do normally in the spring. The only difference is your beds are brand new, so you're not going to have put tarps on them. You missed that opportunity. You're not going to be raking back mulch and direct seeding. You're just gonna go straight to a deep mulch system with transplanted crops, and you're of course not going to be mow killing or solarizing cover crops because your beds are brand new. So you just kind of omit the tarps, the raking back mulch, and the terminating of cover crops, and you just go straight to a deep mulch system and go with transplants into that. Okay, let's say you're really running behind. And you're not able to get your beds in until the summer. That's fine too. So what you could do is you could go in with the BCS, with the riding tractor, whatever, construct your beds, and then from there, when you do that disturbance in the summer, you're gonna have kind of bare soil, because that's what the bed establishment does. When you construct the beds, you are disturbing the soil, and the soil is going to be bare. From there, you could go two directions. You could go the same direction you would have gone in the spring if you had established your beds then. You can go to a deep mulch system and transplant into that. Remember, putting that mulch down after you've constructed your beds in the spring and summer, it's going to halt that annual weed pressure, and it's going to start to weaken those perennial weed systems. So you could go deep mulch, and then you could go straight to transplant crops. Another alternative is you could construct your beds in the summer and then go right into warm season cover cropping. So maybe you're not planning on doing any economic crops this year. You just want to get your beds established and want to start focusing on soil health. So that disturbance when you construct the beds and all the soil's bare and overturned, that's a great opportunity to broadcast warm season cover crops. One other thing you could do in the summer, not necessarily bed construction, but you could do a more lengthy solarization. If you have a lot of perennial weed pressure on your site that you've chosen, you could just solarize it for the whole summer. For they say 6 to 8 weeks will take out most perennial root systems. So you could use that UVI plastic and solarize your site for the summer months, and then you would pick right back up in the fall with bed construction. And the difference would be is that those perennial weed systems, they would be way knocked back from that summer solarization event. So these are a few alternatives if you're not able to get your beds constructed at the most ideal time, which would be the fall, like we talked about. To wrap up, I want to reiterate weed pressure. I know I mentioned that term a lot, but it's really worth addressing, especially in the beginning. Eventually, a few seasons from now, your site is going to have very little weed pressure if you follow all of these steps. But remember, in the beginning is when the weed pressure is going to be the highest. You're working to deplete the annual weed seed bank, and you're working to deplete perennial weed root systems. So the key topics that we covered include keeping the soil covered, right? So we cover it with tarps. That's going to help break the weed cycles. Or we cover it with deep mulches. That's either going to keep annual weed seeds from sprouting, and they'll eventually decompose and decay in the soil, or it's going to be weakening perennial root systems so that when they do come up, they're very easy to pull.
and they are being starved of energy, so they're not being able to reproduce and replicate and expand. Another thing is, don't let weeds go to seed in your garden, right? We don't want annual weed seeds going to seed. We're trying to reduce the weed seed bank. If you let one crabgrass seed sprout, grow, and produce seeds, that one seed in your seed bank now has produced potentially hundreds or thousands of seeds, that one seed. So you really, really, really want to keep weeds, whether they're perennial or annual, you want to keep them from going to seed. You want to hand pull perennial weeds. So perennial weeds, you're using those mulches and those tarps to weaken them, but as they come up through those mulches, especially during the warm season, things like Bermuda grass, for example, as they come up, they're getting sunlight. And if you let them come up and get sunlight, they're going to be capturing that solar energy and storing that solar energy down into their root systems, which is going to give them more energy to grow later. So when you see a perennial weed like Bermuda grass coming up through your mulch, that's when you got to be on it. You got to pull that weed right then and there, so that you don't give it the opportunity to store, to capture and store energy in its root system. You want to pull it out. And trust me, these deep mulch systems, they really weaken the plants by robbing them of sunlight, and it creates an environment where those plants start to decay and the microorganisms come in and they start to work on those root systems, breaking down that organic matter, and in effect it makes it much easier to pull these weeds out. So much easier to pull out Bermuda grass if it's been under mulch for several weeks than it is to just pull it out if it hasn't. Remember, like we talked about with tillage, soil disturbance brings weed seeds to the surface. And as you saw in the video today, some soil disturbance is necessary for bed establishment. We had to use the rotary plow, we had to use the plow, we had to use the disc. Those implements do stir up the soil, and they are going to bring weed seeds that were buried deep in the soil and not viable. They may bring those to the surface. And that's okay. You know, we're going to deal with those weed seeds, but no, the less disturbance, the better. Stale bed method. This is one method that I just thought I'd mention. This is a method where after a disturbance, right after you've shaped your beds, you can leave the soil bare, and you can water it. You know, you don't want a thunderstorm falling on, bare soil, but if the weather's fair, you can have that bare soil, you can water it, and what you're doing is any weed seeds that were brought to the surface by the bed establishment implements, those weed seeds will sprout when you water them. And that's fine, because you can go in after they've sprouted and you can kill them all. So you could do that mechanically with like a hoe, or like a shallow cultivation. You could do that with like a flame weeder. You could do that if it's hot enough. You could use solar tarping to do that. There's multiple ways to do that, but letting all those weed seed sprouts germinate, that's not necessarily a bad thing if you're able to come in immediately and wipe them all out. That's a great way to deplete your soil weed seed bank. I wanted to give a quick shout out to Rick Bost. Dr. Bost attended our course last year, and he's very, very passionate about supporting the efforts of the Farmer Incubator. And one thing he did for us is he bought the BCS tractor with the flail mower, rotary plow, and power harrow attachments, and he's made those fully available to anyone in our class and our network. And I mean, this is $12,000 worth of equipment. So thank you so much, Rick, for making this tool available to us. It's been a real game changer. So that concludes the bed preparation class. I would strongly encourage you all to watch this presentation again. There was a lot of new concepts introduced, and not only did we introduce a lot of concepts, we introduced them on a timeline, so it's important to know the sequence
of the concepts and how they relate to each other. Hopefully you found this information very helpful. If any of it is unclear after rewatching the presentation, please send your questions to me. Tell me where you're at in this sequence. You know, where do you want to go? What are your goals for this season? What are your challenges based on what you've learned from this video? We can start from wherever you're at, and we can help you move forward. So please don't hesitate to contact me. You know, you can give me a call, you can email me. My contact info is right there. I am here to help you and assist with all of your market farming endeavors this year. So excited to be working with you, even though the conditions aren't ideal in the context of COVID. We're still making things happen, and so glad to be with you all.